Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Ontario's World War I History, 100 Years On at Vimy, Passchendaele, and Hill 70, our second webinar of 2017. My name is Sarah McCabe, and I'm the Project Manager and Librarian at the Ontario Historical Society. We're delighted to have a full house today here for this special event, so thank you everyone and welcome. Quick word about the OHS. The Ontario Historical Society is a not-for-profit corporation, publisher of Ontario History Journal, and registered charity. We're a non-government group founded in 1888, bringing together people of all ages, all walks of life, and all cultural backgrounds, interested in preserving some aspect of Ontario's history. By the way, this weekend, John Mackenzie House, our historic house headquarters in North York, is open for visiting for Doors Open Toronto, Saturday and Sunday from 10 to 5. I'm going to very briefly go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. So we've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something like this on your own computer. If you're listening in through your computer speaker system by default, but if you'd prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You may submit text questions for today's presenter by typing them into the question panel of the control panel. And you can send these in at any time and we'll hold on to them until they'll be addressed during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So everyone's joined in listen-only mode. We're going to try something new for the first time. If you happen to have a microphone, or if you've called in by telephone, you'll have the opportunity to speak to ask a question during the Q&A at the end by clicking that raised hand button to ask to be unmuted. So please keep that option in mind. If you lose your connection, try closing the webinar window and then re-entering the room using the link you received in the email. Closing and restarting will often solve the problem. This webinar will be recorded and that recording will be made available on the OHS website shortly. And we'll also make today's slides available this week, so don't worry about writing everything down. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, R.H. Robert Thompson. R.H. Thompson is one of Canada's foremost actor-directors and has received numerous awards over his 35-year career. In 2001, he wrote and performed a highly personal play, The Lost Boys, based on letters written home by his 5 great-uncles who fought in World War I. Its television version delivered his second Gemini Award. And you may know he's currently playing the lovely Matthew Cuthbert in the CBC Netflix series Anne. Robert is joining us today from Toronto in his capacity as producer of a special commemorative project called the WorldRemembers, which I read that CBC Morning's Matt Galloway has called a colossal undertaking to represent the colossal losses suffered 100 years ago. Hello, Robert. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Sarah.
Hooray.
Nice to hear you.
Delighted. We are so pleased to have you with us today. I know you want to do a quick poll to begin, so I'm going to go ahead and launch it. Everyone, let's see. So our poll is, everyone, had you heard of the WorldRemembers project before this webinar? If you could please select the appropriate response and click submit. Just take a quick look here. Okay, so thank you for responding. I'm sharing the results here. It looks like about half of you have and about half of you haven't. So that's good to know. Terrific. Robert, if you're all set, I'm going to turn this over to you.
I am all set. Thanks, Sarah.
Perfect. You're welcome. Just 1 second and we'll switch screens. Bear with us. And here we go.
Right, and I click on this on the screen. And there we go.
And there you are. Over to you.
So do I have everyone now, Sarah?
You do.
I just want to say hello to everyone and thank you very much for joining this webinar. Sarah sent me a map with all that, with a little, little Google dot where everyone is, and it's just fantastic to see the spread all across Ontario and the interest in this, which is just fantastic. It's very interesting that about half of you have heard of the WorldRemembers and the other half haven't, and that's all my fault. But it is a project that's trying to capture the imaginations of how do we commemorate war, how do we remember war in a way that really reflects the count of who we are today, rather than the count of who we were back then, which is an interesting question about remembrance, which has actually driven me into the whole interest in World War I. I mean, I'll be very clear off the beginning. I'm not a historian, and neither am I a scholar, so I work in the arts. So I'm not an expert in those fields. So please, we can do in the Q&A, take what I say with a grain of salt. You'll find that I'm opinionated, and you can come back at me over the opinions, and we can have a great discussion. I guess I entered the world of World War I history through the letters of my family that always been in my family. There was a family from Brantford, the Stratfords, who were my father's uncles. And in that family, 5 brothers, I think there were 10 children in all, 2 girls and 8 boys. And 5 of the boys signed up and went over in World War I. 2 were killed there. 2 came back and died afterwards in the sanatoriums from, destruction from their lungs, from the gas and disease. And only one, the youngest of the brothers, who fought, his name was Art. He's the only one who survived, and it's he who I remember as an old man. The little sister of the family, and this is entering into history for me, is not through the front door, through the textbook, through the paragraph heading. It's entering through the personal. And the little sister of the family, which is Maiden, which is really why I'm here talking today, she collected every letter that all her brothers sent. She collected every letters that when her mother went over from a nurse who was over there, she collected all those letters. And there's 760 letters from this one family about World War I. And she then collated the letters into like 5 or 6 booklets, one for each boy, one for the whatever, one for the mother, and one for, if you look from the second row, if you're seeing your PowerPoint, there's a row of nurses, 3 rows of nurses and 2 rows of Army Medical Corps. On the right above the nurse with the dark sweater in the front row, right above her is a nurse second in. And she, on her right shoulder, there's a naval surgeon. On the left shoulder, there's a nurse. Well, that nurse in the middle, right above the nurse with the dark sweater, in the second row, is my godmother. And there's a set of letters from her as well, because she went over and she worked in a Canadian military hospital. So the letters are from her, and when she died, I got her photograph book. So my entry to the First World War is really reading the letters of all these guys who went over there, all my great uncles. And when I was 16, I was utterly bored by the letters because they didn't talk about war. It says, send more socks, and how's Joe, and I'm going to see George, and I got 2 days leave, and boy, it's pretty cold out here. Can you send some more socks? And it got very hard to understand the reality of what they were in by reading what they chose to tell their family, because most of the letters were to their mother. And only when I decided to write a play about it, and I got the regimental war diaries of each of the regiments of the boys of these 5 guys. And I would read a letter, and it would be from George, and he would say, well, yeah, just got back from leave. It's been pretty stiff fighting, but we're okay. Not many officers left. Could you send me more socks? And when I looked up the regimental war diary for the date that he wrote that letter, I saw he was in the Battle of Passchendaele. And somehow in that, me as a layperson, I began to see inside the war and inside his experience of the war and why he would choose to downplay it in the letter and what he was actually in. And that started the journey into trying to understand, as I say, not the chapter endings of World War I, not the real history of the sort of the straight ahead history, but the social history of what it was like for them, what it was like for those Canadians at home, what it was like for my great-grandmother. And that began this journey of exploration. So these 5 boys and the letters sort of brought me into the side door of of World War I. A number of the pictures you're going to see now are actually from my godmother, Margaret Kilmaster, because second on the left, she had the camera, and these are pictures from her. I want to talk about, also because I come from the theater, we tell stories a lot. And we're very aware that when you tell the story of The Killing Mockingbird or Inexpressible Island or Anne of Green Gables or Hamlet, that the writer has framed the story a certain way. And the idea of the viewpoint or the frame of a story is important to the content of the story. And I extrapolate that to say the frame in which you remember things is almost as important as the content of the memory. The frame in which you remember history is almost as important as the content of history. And therefore, this question of frames, who is framing it? Where does the frame come from, so to speak? This leads us into, this is an opening slide to the World Remembers display that shows the names of everyone killed in World War I 100 years after their deaths. And you'll notice there's 5 languages on there, which reflect, I'm missing Italian, that's got to be added this year. So it reflects, it's the World Remembers in English, French, German, Turkish, and Belgium, Flemish. And we chose this picture because we're not sure if those men walking are British, Canadian, Australian, Belgian, German, French. Oh, wait a minute, if I look at the helmet, that's got to be someone in the Commonwealth forces. But the purpose of the World Remembers is to try to say what were the frames. Generally, the history of World War I, the telling of the histories of World War I has gone through 3 stages. The first stage was in the 1920s, 1930s, and it was very much pro-victory. We were right, they were wrong. It was called the Great War, the Great Sacrifices, very little questioning of what went on in the war or why there were millions of deaths. The second wave of history were a number of historians and soldier poets who started to say the official history, the straight-up history, really doesn't address what we think was really wrong with World War I. And a second sort of reactionary telling of the history, that it was a mess, the generals were incompetent, the deaths weren't warranted, it should never have gone for 4.5 years, it didn't really solve anything. This kind of history was a second phase of telling the history of World War I. And then the third phase, which is sort of now, is a more balanced approach, saying, yes, maybe it was a necessary war, or maybe not. There's big questions. Markham Macmillan writes about this. And it's a more nuanced, let's look at all the bits and pieces. Part of this is to say that when I go back to the idea about frames, let's take Omar Khadr. Let's talk about Omar Khadr for a little bit. Omar Khadr, if you remember, he's just been released. He's living in Alberta. He was a child. He was with the was he with the Taliban or the Al Qaeda? Anyway, he was caught in a firefight in Afghanistan by the Americans. He was accused of being enemy combatant. He was severely wounded. He was accused of killing 2 American soldiers in this firefight. He was in Guantanamo for a number of years. And 2 narratives came up about 2 frames of how do you tell the story of Omar Khadr. The first frame, which was one put up right away, that he was a terrorist. He was working for Al Qaeda. He was a killer. And therefore he didn't, everyone in Guantanamo did not deserve the rule of law, and therefore they were in this kind of extrajudicial place and ex-national place off American soil, so American laws didn't apply. Then a second narrative started to appear that said, no, he actually isn't a terrorist. He's a child soldier, and we have international laws about child soldiers, and that he is not the terrorist. He's a child who was brought up, indoctrinated, was involved in this fight, and was found severely wounded underneath. And when he confessed to the killing, he actually confessed because he was given the devil's choice. You confess, and maybe you'll be in jail for whatever, 10 or 15 years, you don't confess, and you'll be in Guantanamo for the rest of your life. And so these two competing narratives of who is Omar Khadr and what was his war. World War I is exactly like that. So I say, what are the frames on the war? The question. Second question, who made the frames? And third question, what does that frame do to the history of it? If you look at, take Vimy, for example. Vimy was an extraordinary battle for the Canadians. It's a very large national celebration for us, and rightly so. 97,000 Canadians went up that ridge, and 3,500 were killed. And it was very important for us because we were almost under Canadian command, and it's been cast as this iconic battle. And Walter Allward did an amazing monument in France. It is a truly stunning monument. So it's very important to us. A number of military historians look at it and go, we're not sure. The Battle of Vimy was actually a sideshow of a sideshow of a sideshow. It really didn't make any difference to World War I. The Canadians actually weren't fighting under Canadian command. They were still under British generals, and there were British troops in it. And so there's another frame on that. And so the question is, why do we frame it in such brightly polished, strong frame of, it was the birth of a nation, it's when Canada showed themselves on the battlefield. Why do we put those frames on them? And why are we uncomfortable with a frame of a military historian said, well, it really wasn't an important battle. It was a sideshow of the Battle of Arras, of a larger battle. So those questions are important as we look at World War I. It's linked, framing is linked to censorship, and every war brings censorship. We all know the Iraq War, the media were embedded with the American Army and the British Army, so the question is, do you have an independent view if your journalists are in fact embedded with one force and not the other? And so some journalists try to get independent. There's three sort of layers to censorship. There's the overt layer, like in World War I. You were not allowed to say certain things in the in the Canadian papers, right? You couldn't criticize the war in Canadian papers. That was going on. So there was overt censorship about my great uncle's letters were censored. They all went through the Army censor, and very rightly so, because they couldn't say, hey, I'm 14 miles south of Arras, and we just taken 300 meters of German territory. They couldn't say that. The second layer of censorship is where you don't need a censor because the population of the journalists, of the soldiers, have already decided to internally censor themselves. They say, well, I can't say that, so I won't say it. And it's a censorship that you see more in totalitarian countries. You saw in the Soviet Union, you saw in the East Bloc, where people go, you just don't say that anymore because you don't want to get in trouble. And that's the kind of, say, a second layer, harder to see because people internalize the censorship. The third layer underneath is related to framing. And I believe it becomes an unconscious thing that you've done to actually frame or restrict what you actually think about. And this is the most insidious because it really is a loss of independence. If you cannot see this subconscious frame that you've just built yourself into that you can't see, but yet you're operating under it. And I call it a mental map in the mind. So part of my comments are always to say, well, let's try to shake it all up, and let's look at things from every point of view before we make a decision. And some of this may be offensive to some, because take, for example, Remembrance Day. The frame of Remembrance Day is very honorable. In Canada, it's our troops were great, and they were great. It was a hard-won victory. We have a National War Memorial, which is based like a victory arch in Ottawa. It has a flaming angel on top. Well, it's not flames, but it's a great angel. It's a remarkable monument. And we frame remembrance from our point of view. We won implies they lost. And we don't invite other nations to there are international representatives from the embassies, but we don't involve other nations. It's very much about us. And I suggest that's a frame. And that frame does certain things to how you remember. The other thing on Remembrance Day is we only remember them. And part of me, maybe the artist part of me or maybe the humanist part of me goes, I'm a little uncomfortable about that now. Because there was Robert, there was Jacques, there was Louis, there was Fred, there was Emile. They're not them. They're a people. But they're never remembered on Remembrance Day. And in a way, Remembrance Day becomes more about us than about them. And I go, wait a minute. Remembrance Day is remembering them. One of the soldiers' greatest fears that you read about in World War I is their deaths would be totally forgotten, wiped over, so to speak. And so that is an impeller. So it says the World Remembers saying, okay, well, let's look at remembrance in terms of Robert, Jacques, Bill, Fred, Emile, Louis, all of them, and name them. So that's what the project does. It says 100 years later, for the first time in our history, we need to name each and every one of them in public and tell the families when the names will appear. Here's I'm put up a shot of, this is a shell factory from the UK. Censorship and framing and mental maps are a natural thing that we do. None of us could get out of bed every day if every worry in our lives popped into our mind the moment we woke up. So in fact, the way you restrict the way you see the world is actually the way to survive the world. You could say that PTSD is a way where the soldier or the person in crisis has been unable to censor or restrict the stimulus that are coming at them in terms of the accident, the killing, the disaster, the Manchester bombing. And that PTSD happens when the brain is overwhelmed by actually seeing and perceiving all of it. Romeo Dallaire talks about this, that a soldier has to restrict what they see in the battlefield and what they feel emotionally and all the stimuli they get, otherwise they can't take it. And we know that PTSD is a huge problem now. We know the PTSD of the 158 Canadians who were killed in Afghanistan. We were in Afghanistan for 7 years. And we now know that I think 71 have committed suicide. 71 of those who returned home have since committed suicide. And that number is rising. The British Army found out when they went to the Falklands that in the years since the Falklands War, more British soldiers who served in the Falklands have committed suicide than were killed by the Argentinians. And it's starting to disturb a lot of the Army people because they're saying there's the literal wounds you get during the war, and then there's the far more destructive wounds that happen in the years and decades afterwards, so to speak. And so then again, this is a way of saying, well, what do we then do about war? How do we remember it? So the world remembers. Let me go to my next slide here. So the aftermath that happened in Canada, we don't talk about a lot. We don't talk about what happened in Northern Ontario or Southern Ontario or Toronto or Kingston or Ottawa. We know that the men who came back, there were 450,000 volunteers who went over, and then there was then conscription. And we know that there were kind of 3 stages to the war in Canada. There was the very enthusiastic first stages of the war. It's going to be over by Christmas. It's a great British adventure for empire. It's going to be glorious. And that stage ended about a year and a half into the war. And by the time they got into 1916 and you had the killing on the Somme and the slaughter, people understood that this was a long war and was going to kill millions. And at that point, volunteerism started to drop off. All the questions about conscription started to happen, that we need more men. And by 1960, 1970, the wounded were starting to come back. So that force was happening, so to speak. I'm taking too long here. I got to move down the road here. I'm going to move on to, I go back to frames of it, because here are some of the First World War posters, as it were. And let's just talk about some of the frames. Okay, this is your flag. It stands for liberty. Fight for it. Did Canadians fight for liberty in World War I? My answer is no. Canada's liberty was never in question. Britain's liberty was never in question. The only liberty in question was Belgium. So the reason the British went to war is because of Belgium, and we really had no choice. Australia, they didn't even have to pass it in Parliament. They were automatically in. So they didn't really fight for liberty. They fought for flag. So they were fighting for a British view of the world. They weren't fighting for a Canadian point of the world, because Canada at that time, British Canada at that time, about 4 million. There were 4 Canadas in World War I. We tend to think of a monolith, but there's 4 of them. There's British Canada, which really wanted to, which was very pro-empire and very pro-British at the time. And British Canada was about 4 million, and it was a massive British immigration that happened 1890, 1900, 1905. And British Canada supplied by far the greatest number of volunteers. So the flag and the officer is somewhat logical. The second Canada was French Canada. And French Canada was 2 million, I think. French Canada was 2 million, and was not at all lined up for British Empire. This did not make sense to them. The British Queen was their stepmother, so to speak, and they really didn't even feel like fighting for France, because France had abandoned Quebec. The third Canada was what was called New Canadian Canada, or ethnic Canada, and here's where the social tensions began to arise. Because the ethnic Canadians, these are the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Romanians, the Czechs, the Austrians, the Italians, the Slovenians, these were not the British stock, so to speak. And the tensions, ethnic Canada or new immigrant Canada, were not particularly enthusiastic about the war. Many of them came from Austria, Slovenia, or Czechoslovakia, Poland. The Poles were in the Russian army, the Poles were in the German army, the Poles were in the Austro-Hungarian army. So this was the third Canada that was very uneasy about it, and British Canada began to resent new nation Canada, the new immigrant Canada. And the fourth Canada, of course, was First Nations Canada, and they were in terrible shape at that point. It was probably the low point for First Nations, and there seemed to be very little hope for them. Last thing I point out about this is the officers, and in this is the framing of the officers, and the officers were indeed traditionally, they were from the upper classes, and the armies of World War I were the last sort of remnants of what I call the peasant armies. The commoners provided soldiers, who were the cannon fodder, and the officers from the upper classes went to the right schools, had the axe, and officers all had their servants, right? They were called batmen. And so an officer had their servant, and it really was the vestige of a class system, and those armies were the last vestiges of the class system. And that was all blown away in World War I. Here's 4 officers, Paris Peak Conference. We will not talk about their probable incompetence, why it ended up with 16 million people dead when they thought the war would last for 2 or 3 months, and why they underestimated what's going on. The man on the left is, what was it? He's British. Oh gosh, 2 British, French and Italian. And here we are in another World War. Shall we help to crush tyranny? Here come the frames, and look at the frames again. Were they crushing tyranny? Was Germany a tyranny? Well, Germany was a monarchy, the same as Russia was a monarchy, same as Britain was a monarchy. So where did the tyranny come from? And so again, the tyranny is a kind of framing that is put on this. And if you look at the use of the language at the top of the poster, the priceless gem of liberty, the gold, the glory, the wealth is honor. And contrast that with the abysmal things that were happening on the battlefield, the abysmal wastage of life on the battlefield. The way British command in particular was just saying, well, it's a war of attrition now. Let's just send 100,000 out, and if we kill more Germans, if we lose 30,000 and they lose 40,000, that's good. We'll wear each other down. And which stands very much in contrast to kind of framing of what this war was about. Let's go to the realities of the war. In the WorldRemembers project, we show the names of the Canadians killed. This year, we show the names of the Canadians killed in 1917, plus the names from 13 other nations. Every 15 minutes, we show photographs of the war. And we will only show one photograph of the dead, and this is the photograph. Some teachers who show the display, we had a discussion with them, and I said, you know, we don't have any pictures of the dead. We got pictures of, you know, the soldiers, the wounded, the nurses, the refugees, the munitions workers in Toronto, the war mothers, soldiers in training, soldiers in combat, but we don't show pictures of the dead, and it seemed odd not to put one photograph of what was happening to the millions. So this is one of the pictures of the dead. There's no framing in this picture. Look at the indifference that some soldiers are walking by. These are French. Look at the indifference with which one of the bodies is being looked at. One of the coat is pulled over the face. The man in the foreground, his face is not pulled over. And that is the reality of what went on. Here's another picture we show. These are the grave markers. There are stories of the soldiers being marched to the front, walking by scenes like this, and seeing the crosses stacked up. Notice in the background, those are Chinese. So again, to open up the story of World War I, those are Chinese laborers. There were 3,000 Chinese laborers killed. There were 300 Chinese Canadians in World War I. Who knew? Chinese laborers is an interesting story itself. As you try to open up the war again, come in the side door and look at it. They were running out of guys to fight the war in France and Belgium. So they were looking for labor recruits. So 140,000 young Chinese guys from the south of China were employed by the French and the British. They came in ships to Vancouver. They were put in locked trains, sealed trains, and shipped across the country. And then they went, and there were 3,000 killed, and they did battlefield clearance and graveyards and all the rest of it. Some of their graves are in Canada. There's 5 graves, 5 Commonwealth War graves in Vancouver and 6 in Nova Scotia, because they died in transit. And so that residual history of World War I, and they probably came from they came through the northern Ontario, right? So the train would have come, you know, Vancouver, Winnipeg, across the northern Ontario, then probably through Ottawa, and then straight on through. So again, it's trying to look at the edges of history and to see how it goes. Let's go to this. This is 1917. Let's talk about French Canada. And what we do not remember when we talk about Vimy is how much Vimy was part of a big separation in this country. French Canada really didn't want to be conscripted. There were riots. People were killed in the riots in Quebec. They were adamant they would not be conscripted by British Canada into a war they didn't agree with. And when the politicians were torn, because if they didn't bring in conscription, they're looking at 400,000 returning troops who would come back and say, what? Most of the recruitment was from British Canada and very little was from French Canada. And they looked at the social tensions that they would inherit if that was the scenario. By this point, too, early 1917, late 1917, it really was not certain they would win. And defeat looked very much a possibility. In fact, they almost lost the war in the spring of 1918 when the Germans again almost got to Paris. So again, you looked at the country in 1917 saying we got to bring in conscription, and if we lose the war, we have 400,000 Canadian troops coming back who are not happy, A, because they lost the war, and second, because a whole bunch of Canadians didn't join. And this became a really virile kind of tension, and the beginning of the splits in Canada between the new Canadians, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and all the rest of the French Canadians. It was not a time of unity at all, so to speak. This is a picture, another picture we show. This is the Chinese labor battalions. Russians. The other thing that they were terrified, not terrified, let's not exaggerate, that it wasn't unity in 1916, 1917, when they realized the number of losses, the number of funerals, the number of war mothers, and the pushback that was happening. They worried about, people in Ontario would be worried about, oh, those Ukrainians, those Poles, they're all socialists. You know, there's going to be a revolution. You can't trust them. You can only trust British Canadians. They were worried about Canada turning into Ireland. Right? There was the Easter Rebellion in 1916 against British rule by the Irish Republicans. So people wondered and worried about rebellions within countries during the war. And they said, we're going to end up like Ireland. You know, there'll be a rebellion. And then the Russian Revolution came along, and they said, we could end up like Russia. So again, the worries about social cohesion, and that ended up in a lot of sedition trials and a lot in Canada. There were more sedition trials than in the UK. The story of the farmer in Walkerton who was, he was in a bar, you know, and he's saying to his friend, he said, you know, I got 2 sons, I would never send them to that war because every soldier in the army, they're all drunks. So he called them drunks. Well, the farmer next to him had sons in the war. So he went to the police, and this guy was charged with sedition, and he was fined $2,000. In 1917, that's a lot of money, $2,000. There was a recruitment meeting in Toronto, and a guy called John Ness. And when the recruiting sergeant said to the crowd, he said, okay, everyone raise your hand. Everyone who's supporting the troops, raise your hand. Well, John Ness didn't raise his hand. And the outraged other men in the crowd beat him. And he was charged with sedition. And he got 30 days in jail for interfering with a meeting. So these tensions were in Canada and pushing through Canada during the war. The world remembers, I just want to, these are, we're going to do a large display in the names of 1970. We're going to do them in Ottawa. We're going to do them hopefully in Old City Hall here in Toronto. And, you know, we're asking, they will also appear in Germany at the Bundeswehr Military History Museum. They will appear in Belgium, in the Flanders Field Museum. They will appear in a number of locations in the United Kingdom. We have 60 locations so far across Canada. These are schools, universities, community halls, libraries, historical societies, anybody. We want you to show the display. And we're also in the United States in their National World War I Museum. And to give you an idea of the frame, here is, this is a talk about frames. So I tried very hard because I had to get Britain into the project. And I have to license the data from all these countries so we can show the British names, 830,000 British names. And so a number of countries said, you know, we'll join your project, Robert, but you have to have Britain, France, and Germany. If you don't have those 3 countries, you don't have a project, you know. You can have Ireland, you can have Canada, you can have Australia, New Zealand, Italy, and Belgium. But if you don't have the big 3, so I worked very hard to try to get the UK in. And again, just to show you, and here's the one we said it could go behind the cenotaph. This is on Whitehall. And we're very careful in if this was the Canadian display, we would put the Canadian name in the center and the international names around the outside because we would respect in Canada the Canadian name, but we would also include the British name, Australian name, you know, Czech name, Italian name. This is the British display, so the 3 British names in the center, and then the international names around the outside. And I worked hard at meetings at the Palace. I met Culture, Media, and Sport, Ministry of Defense, and finally, in my desperation to get the British in, I went to the press. So I went to the London Sunday Times and I said, look, you guys got to help me. This is a project. We want to honor every British soldier killed in World War I. And here's a display. You could put it up here. We respect the British names. We put the international names around the outside. And at the end of the phone interview with this guy, Nicholas Helen from the London Sunday Times, he said, will there be German names in it? I said, yeah, there's going to be German names in it. It's going to be American names, Slovenian names, Chinese names, Australian names, Czech names, British names, Canadian names. Yeah, there's going to be German names. So then he published this article. And this pretty well killed us in the UK. He called it a tribute to the German war dead. And this is not a tribute to the German war dead. So the framing of this is, why could he only see it from that point of view? That 100 years later, they remained the enemy, even though Germany is our biggest NATO ally. And this is a framing. And this is something that the World Remembers tries very hard to move past, saying it's no longer appropriate to not mention the Italian Canadian, the Pakistani Canadian, the Indo-Canadian, the Slovenian Canadian, the German Canadian, the Australian Canadian, the Scottish Canadian, the British Canadian. These are all important for who we are now. And that's the aim of this project. We talk about history, and we can talk about facts, and we can talk about frames. What else came out of World War I were the poets. And for the first time, there were soldier poets. There's the traditional poets, which is usually a lot of people call doggerel now. And then from the trenches came men who started to write poetry. And maybe because I come from the arts, it is a way of appreciating what went on. Okay, not through the front door, not through the headline, not through the paragraph heading. So these are two Canadian soldiers. And I want to read a poem called Disabled by Wilfred Owen. He's a British poet, British soldier poet. He was decorated and he was killed a week before the end of the war. He's writing about a man in a wheelchair, and these men existed in every part of Canada in 1919 through 1920s. I remember them when I was a school kid in Richmond Hill in 1956. You know, the very old men who, you know, didn't have, their pant leg was sewn up in an odd way, or their arm or their sleeve or their shirt was pinned up at their shoulder. And these were the remnants. I want to read this poem by Disabled because I think it's another way of addressing how do you think about war. It's called Disabled. He sat in a wheeled chair, waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of gray, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day. The gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time, the town used to swing so gay with glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim. In the old times, before he threw away his knees. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, or how warm their subtle hands. All of them touch him now like some queer disease. There was an artist, silly for his face, for it was younger than his youth last year. Now he's old, his back will never brace. He lost his color very far from here, poured it down shell holes, till the veins ran dry, and half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race and leap of purple spurting from his thigh. One time he liked a blood smear down his leg. After matches, carried shoulder high. It was after football, when he'd drunk a peg. He thought he'd better join. He wonders why. Someone had said he'd look a god in kilts. And soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer goal. Only a solemn man who brought him fruits and thanked him, and then inquired about his soul. Now he will spend a few sick years in institutes and do whatever things the rules consider wise, and take whatever pity they may dole. Tonight he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come? The poem's called Disabled by Wilfred Owen. If we can persuade you to join the WorldRemembers, it would be fantastic. The display is something that we want as many organizations to do as possible, as many schools, as many Legion halls, as many libraries. In the names that will be shown this year, there will be 20,400 Canadian names of those killed in 1917. And that includes everyone killed at Vimy and Passchendaele on Hill 70. And 680,000 other names and you will see the list of countries there. Oh, the China isn't in. I just got the Chinese names, so the Chinese names will be there. The point of the project is not information. The point of the project is to say every family in every part of Ontario who lost them in World War I, they're important. And therefore, when a name appears, it is programmed to appear at an exact day, hour, and minute. So, well, one of my great uncles, George Stratford, was killed at Passchendaele. So I'll be able to go to the website, WorldRemembers.ca, go to search the names, which army, Canadian Army, which year, 1917. I type in Stratford, oh, a whole bunch of Stratfords, find out George. And then we'll say a bit about George. Yes, he was this. Yes, he was that. He was recently made lieutenant and whatever. And then his name will say, his name will appear October the 28th at 2:18. So the Stratford family, or any family who lost one, knows the exact minute to turn up. And at that minute, we say, your family and your story is important. And again, it's a way to remember war without framing it. It's the people that we want to remember. And so we want the Indo-Canadian kids in Brantford, Ontario, to see the Sikh names who were killed. 74,000 Sikhs were killed, or from British Indian Army. We want the Vietnamese Canadians to see, oh yeah, in the French names, there's some Vietnamese names. We want the Italian Canadians. We want all Canadians to say you are part of this, even if you're German Canadian. I want to close. Sorry, yeah, here's the German. Oh no, I want to close with the words of Gregory Clark. Gregory Clark wrote for the Toronto Star. He was a major in World War I in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and then he wrote for the Star. In 1934, the Star published a series of World War I photographs. And the Star was, as I say, there were three periods of history. In the first, very pro-victory, we were wonderful, they were terrible. And then, as the poetry came out and the war started to be questioned, there was a second period of history, and this is in the second period. And the Star published a number of pictures over the weeks from World War I. And Gregory Clark wrote the captions, and they weren't fall into line and obey. They were saying, here's the complexity of the war. And there was one picture that showed Canadians outside a dressing station in Ypres after the Battle of Passchendaele. And among these damaged Canadians, there was a German soldier. And what Clark wrote, I'm sorry, I don't have the picture here, what Clark wrote underneath the picture that appeared in the paper in 1934. He looks at the pictures of the Canadians, and there's the Germans within the Canadians. And he says, there seems to be a little hate here, but of course, these are just common frontline soldiers. Every mile you went back of the line, the hate grew stronger, until at last, when you got right back to civilization, there you found hate in its pure, unadulterated essence. The boys called him Jerry. Back home, they called him the Hun. And that goes a long way to try to explain how, or look at the frames that were there and look at how do we deframe and how do we get to the reality, because it's the reality of the war that we want to remember and commemorate, and not the frames that someone's put there. I'll close on a picture, great picture of Canadians. We try to choose these pictures. We have 240 of them. They appear every 15 minutes on the display. Every 15 minutes, the names disappear and a picture appears. And so this is a picture that appears for 30 seconds. Thank you very, very much. I've talked too long. We have a bit of time for question and answer, so I pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Robert. So much food for thought and context for Ontario's historical experience. Thank you so much. Going to put the screen back to mine. Okay, we're now going to take questions. We have some, and if you have some, please feel free to type it in the questions pane. Oh, yes, or raise your hand, click the raise your hand button, and we will put you out of listen-only mode to ask a question. So, Robert, you can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Okay, so our first question is from Jonathan Ferguson. Will the names of Russian and Arab soldiers be included in the memorial?
Jonathan Ferguson. Jonathan, it's an excellent question. It was the French Mission de Centenaire said, Robert, you don't have a question without, you don't have a project without Russian names, because the Russians lost more than anybody else. But we ran totally into politics in Russia. And by the time we got into, Russia went into Crimea, and then they went into East Ukraine, it became impossible to politically deal with Russia. Add to that, that they, like the United States, they hadn't actually put together World War I databases. They were a mess because it was a revolution. It was seen as an imperialist war. So short answer, no. There are no Russian names in the project.
Thank you. Kat Chin asks, how much space is needed for the names display? Are there specific dimensions required?
Great question, Katchin. What we do is we provide the kit, so to speak. So we provide the software, we'll provide posters, information things, interpretation things, and you can print whatever you want. You are free to present the display however you want. It can go on a laptop. It can go on a widescreen TV. Some places like the school just south of me, St. George's, you know, they show it for a couple of weeks on a monitor, and then for the last week they take an office projector and they just run it through a projector on their chapel wall. So it'll go on a laptop, on a widescreen TV, or take a little office projector and project it somewhere.
Great. We have a question from Mike Filey. Hi, Mike. Can you hear me? Okay. I'll read the question that he's typed in. RH, it appears you brought the British on side. After the Sunday Times story, how did you get the British to join the project?
Oh, Mike, good question. If you can't go in the front door, go in the side door. So the British government was shutting me down. We were getting, and I couldn't do this project without help from Foreign Affairs. They were really helping, but they were really burning us down. So I got to know Alan Pateman, who was the head of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And Alan was an absolute straight shooter, and I told him the troubles I was having with every British department. And he said, and I said, Alan, you're my last resort. If I can get the money, because I need money from every country, will Commonwealth War Graves provide the British data? He said, absolutely. So I had that. And then there you go. And it's ironic, top to bottom. Hilary Weston of the Garland Weston Foundation, she helped me in the first couple of years through the foundation. She has a British arm of the Garfield Weston Foundation. So in a panic, because I was going to lose all the other countries without Britain, in a panic I went to Hilary Weston and I said, will the British Foundation support the fee to put the British names in? And she said yes. So ironically, the Canadians again supported putting the British names in. So that's how it worked. Don't ask. I cannot. You may know about the Poppy project that went on in the Tower of London, 2014. It was a brilliant project, brilliant. And they had, it was 888,000 poppies, ceramic, colored red. And the artist had them pouring out of the Tower of London into the green of the moat. And it is a stunning remembrance project because each poppy stood for a dead British soldier. And then you step back and you say, okay, there's 888,000. So that means there's the British soldiers and their colonies, but not included are Britain, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. We're not included, or anybody else. You go, what's that about? And then the Quakers put a map out. They said, okay, this is a wonderful display of the poppies, and they're pouring on them. What would it look like if the display put a poppy for every soldier killed in World War I? And the display shows a map of London. It shows the poppies pouring out of the Tower of London, pouring down to the Thames, all flooding the banks of the Thames, all the way down and right up to the steps of the palace. And the Quakers said that's what it looked like if the British would actually step outside their boundaries and saying maybe we should respect everyone. So it's sort of simpatico with the resistance I had in Britain from every level, Ministry of Defense, you know, DCMS, Culture, Media and Sport, Heritage Lottery Fund. It was, I mean, I did the gamut over there. Anyway, we went in the side door.
Thanks for the answer to that. By the way, it was Ted Barris who was asking, not Mike Filey. So thank you very much, Ted.
Hi, Ted.
Question from Heather Anderson. You experienced some animosity from the British press when introducing this project, as you explained. What was your experience working with nations who were on the opposing side to Canada in World War I, such as Germany or Italy?
Heather, it's a great question. The project is a huge learning experience, and partly all my feelings about Remembrance Day when I began to put the different narratives, to understand and appreciate the different narratives that different countries put on war and how you commemorate war. The German example is very interesting because the Germans, for political reason, will not commemorate a soldier before 1953. And they're very sensitive. They say, if we commemorate a dead soldier before 1953, we are implicitly supporting the horror that happened in 39-45, and they won't go near it, so to speak. They will only support projects that say everyone has to be included, and the project has to speak about education and reconciliation. So under those terms, not the German government, because again, they couldn't be seen to support a project commemorating war. It's through a private organization, which actually, like the Commonwealth War Graves, the VDK, the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberversorger, they monitor and track all the German war graves from the 19th century and 20th century. So VDK came on and actually gave some money because they said, you know, this is a way of recognizing the German war dead without putting those political frames on it and saying we're talking about individuals here. We're not talking about flags, ideologies, all the rest of it. So that's how that came in. Serbia was a very interesting. Austria basically went and hid. They would not address it. Turkey was very interesting, and it's changed with Erdogan, and I've lost my contacts in Turkey. Italy was actually on our side in World War I, came in a year late, and they're very iconic about the war. And really it's only the cities in the north of Italy who are up to date on this, and so the databases are being put together not by the government in Rome, the Centrario Prima Guerra, but by individuals, by Bologna and Veneto. These individual groups are trying to put together their databases because I think it was 600,000 Italians were killed. It's an enormous amount. Sorry, long answer, short question.
Not to worry, thank you. Ted Barris adds, by the way, I have a photo that shows Canadian wounded being moved away from Vimy. Assisting the Canadian medics are 4 German POWs, clearly willing to help. Sounds like an amazing photo.
It. Yep, that's it.
Okay, one more question, actually 2 more questions I think we have time for. I saw and loved Lost Boys. Will it be revived, asks Andrew Thompson.
Oh, Andrew Thompson? Is that my Andrew Thompson? I have a son called Andrew Thompson.
Do you really?
I do. Is this Thompson with a P or Thompson without a P?
Without a P.
Oh my God, maybe it's my son. Anyway, if it isn't my son, nice to talk to you anyway.
No relation, no relation.
Oh, so okay, no relation. I would love to do it again. The WorldRemembers is consuming me. It's been burning my life since 2011, and we're up to our eyeballs in it. So I would love to do it again, but thank you for liking the play. Well, it isn't really a play. It's an evening about how do you remember and where you go to with your family. So thank you, Andrew.
And our last question, did you consult, asked Jonathan Ferguson, did you consult with the producers of Vigil 1914 to 1918, and did they offer any suggestions?
Oh, good question. We are the producers of Vigil 1914-1918. The whole project started, you know, these things start small, and we did a one-night projection on the National War Memorial of the 3,400 and whatever names of those killed in Vimy. And again, we timed the names, and the public response was so strong, we then created Vigil, which is to say we have to project the names of the 68,000 Canadians. Again, it's about the people. And it was sort of the second stage, as it were, and we saw how powerful it could be because we did Vigil not only in Toronto City Hall, we did it in Trafalgar Square, We did it in the legislature in Saskatchewan, in Alberta. We missed a couple of provinces, but the response was very strong. So we understood how to then create the impossible project, meaning can you persuade 34 nations to join an international idea?
Terrific. Thank you so much, Robert. It's been a real privilege to have you with us today.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you for the questions. Please get in touch. We'd love you to join the project. We try to keep the fee, we're nonprofits, so we try to keep the fee very low, but we have to pay our bills. And it'll be fantastic because it really is the way of saying that the individuals killed and the Canadians killed are really important, and their families should know that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. A very few notes from me before we close.
Yep.
Please stay tuned for announcements of our upcoming webinars, and the feedback survey we'll be sending you. Please let us know if you have any comments upon this webinar or any topics that would be of interest to you for the future. Very little bit about membership. We do encourage you to become a member of the Ontario Historical Society if you're not already. The Society's programs and services offer great support and resources for historical groups and institutions, historians, students, and educators, and your support will help continue to promote the importance of history education in Ontario's classrooms, museums, and heritage spaces. Please visit the OHS website for more information on becoming a member or contact our membership coordinator. Finally, thanks so much again to our speaker, R.H. Thompson, and thanks to everyone for attending today's session. Thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.